June 3, 1945. The fortress gates of Camp Eldridge swung open with the groan of iron against stone, and the women who shuffled through them carried nothing but the weight of dread. They had been told, in whispers that traveled like poison through the ranks during the final collapse, that American captivity meant violation, starvation, and cruelty beyond imagining. What they could not have known, what none of them were prepared for, was that the enemy's greatest weapon would not be violence, but a pillow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The transport trucks had rattled for hours across roads scarred by tank treads and artillery, carrying 217 women who had once served the Third Reich as signal operators, medical auxiliaries, and administrative clerks. Now they were prisoners, stripped of rank and purpose, their gray uniforms stained with mud and sweat, their hair matted beneath makeshift scarves. The youngest among them was barely 19, the oldest 43. All of them shared the same hollow-eyed exhaustion, the same gnawing fear of what awaited behind American barbed wire. Greta Hoffman sat near the rear of the truck, her spine rigid despite the jolting ride. She was 26, though the war had carved years into her face that belied her age. Her hands, once soft from office work in Nuremberg, were now calloused and cracked. She had spent the last 3 months fleeing westward with a collapsing army, sleeping in ditches, eating whatever scraps could be scavenged from abandoned farms. Her younger sister, Anneliese, had died in the firebombing of their hometown, crushed beneath the rubble of their childhood home. Her father had never returned from the Eastern Front. Her mother's last letter, written in a trembling hand, had arrived 6 months ago, speaking of hunger so profound that neighbors had begun to eye their pets with desperation. Greta carried these memories like stones in her chest. And now, as the truck slowed and the canvas flaps were pulled back, revealing the sprawling expanse of the American prison camp, she braced herself for the final humiliation. The guards who met them were young, their uniforms crisp and clean, their faces neither cruel nor kind, merely professional. They spoke in clipped English, gesturing for the women to form lines. Greta's pulse hammered in her throat. She had heard stories, propaganda broadcast in the final desperate weeks of the Reich, of American soldiers who laughed while prisoners starved, who threw captured women into pits and left them to rot. She had not wanted to believe it, but what choice did belief offer when fear was all that remained? The camp itself was vast, a grid of wooden barracks surrounded by double fences topped with coils of wire. Guard towers rose at intervals, their searchlights dark in the afternoon sun. The ground was level, swept clean of debris, almost unnervingly orderly. There were no piles of corpses, no smoke rising from crematoria, none of the horrors she had steeled herself to witness. Instead, there was silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on gravel and the distant clang of a bell. An American officer, a woman in her 30s with auburn hair pinned beneath a military cap, stepped forward. She spoke in accented but serviceable German, her voice firm but not harsh. "You will be assigned to barracks. You will be fed. You will follow camp regulations. Any attempt to escape will result in solitary confinement. Do you understand?" The women murmured assent, their voices barely audible. Greta felt a flicker of confusion. No threats of beatings. No leering soldiers. Just instructions. It unsettled her more than shouting would have. They were marched in columns toward the barracks, their steps uneven, some limping from blisters and exhaustion. Greta's eyes darted to the other prisoners already in the camp, women in similar gray uniforms standing in small clusters, watching the newcomers with guarded expressions. They looked thin, yes, but not skeletal. Their faces were weary but not brutalized. One woman even offered a small nod, something almost resembling reassurance. The barracks door swung open, and the scent hit Greta first. Not the stench of unwashed bodies in despair she had expected, but something clean, almost astringent. Soap? Disinfectant. The interior was dim but spacious, rows of iron bunks lining the walls, each stacked too high. Wooden floors, swept clean. Windows that let in light. And on each bunk, folded with precision, a thin wool blanket. Greta approached her assigned bunk slowly, as if it might vanish if she moved too quickly. She set down the small bundle she carried, a tattered coat and a broken comb, and stared at the blanket. Beneath it, she saw something that made her breath catch. A pillow. Not a sack stuffed with straw or crumpled newspaper, but an actual pillow, covered in coarse white fabric, soft to the touch when she finally dared to press her fingers against it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her throat tightened. She had not slept on a pillow in over a year. Not since the bombing raids had forced her from her home, not during the long retreat westward, not in the barns and cellars where she had hidden from advancing Allied forces. For months, she had rested her head on bundled clothing, on bare earth, on the cold metal floors of transport trains. And now, in the hands of the enemy, she was being offered something so mundane, so achingly human, that it felt like a betrayal of everything she had endured. Around her, the other women were discovering the same thing. Some stood frozen, staring at their bunks as if they had stumbled into a dream. Others reached out tentatively, touching the pillows with the same reverence one might touch a relic. A woman named Helene, who had worked as a nurse in a field hospital, sank onto her bunk and buried her face in the pillow, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Another, a stern-faced radio operator named Margaret, turned away, her jaw clenched, refusing to acknowledge the gesture. Greta sat down slowly, the bunk creaking beneath her weight. She placed her hand on the pillow, feeling its give, its impossible softness. Her mind rebelled against the sensation. This was the enemy. These were the people who had bombed her cities, who had killed her sister, who had shattered her nation into rubble. And yet here they were, offering pillows as if comfort were a right rather than a privilege earned through loyalty and sacrifice. A voice broke through her thoughts. It's a trick. Margaret stood at the foot of Greta's bunk, her arms crossed, her face hard. They soften us now so we'll talk later. Don't be fooled. Greta said nothing, but the doubt had already taken root. What if Margaret was right? What if this kindness was a strategy, a way to lower their defenses before the real interrogation began? She thought of the propaganda films she had seen, images of American decadence and cruelty intertwined, a nation that gorged itself on luxury while plotting the destruction of others. Surely, this was part of that same twisted logic. But as the afternoon wore on, the evidence continued to accumulate in ways that defied her expectations. A guard appeared at the door, not with a rifle at the ready, but with a clipboard. He announced in broken German that dinner would be served in an hour, that there were wash basins available outside, and that anyone requiring medical attention should report to the infirmary. His tone was matter-of-fact, almost bored, as if he were reading from a script he had repeated 100 times before. Greta followed the others to the wash basins, where buckets of clean water had been set out alongside rough bars of soap. She scrubbed her hands and face, the cold water shocking against her skin, and watched as other women did the same, some laughing nervously, others silent and withdrawn. The act of washing felt almost sacred after so many weeks of filth, and yet it deepened the sense of unreality. This was not how captivity was supposed to feel. When the bell rang for dinner, the women filed into a large mess hall, its walls lined with long wooden tables and benches. The air was thick with the smell of cooking, and Greta's stomach clenched with a hunger so sharp it bordered on pain. She had eaten nothing that day but a crust of bread scavenged from the truck, and before that, only thin gruel ladled from a communal pot at the transit camp. The serving line moved slowly, each woman handed a metal tray and a tin cup. Greta reached the counter and stared at what was being spooned onto her plate. Potatoes, boiled and glistening with butter. A thick slice of bread, dark and dense. A ladle of stew, chunks of meat visible within the broth. And a cup of coffee, real coffee, its aroma almost intoxicating. She carried her tray to a table and sat down, her hands trembling. Around her, the other women ate in silence, some with tears streaming down their faces, others with expressions of stunned disbelief. Greta lifted a spoonful of stew to her lips and tasted it. The flavor was overwhelming, salt and fat and richness that her body had nearly forgotten existed. She ate slowly, mechanically, each bite a war between gratitude and resentment. Across from her, Helene wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "My children," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My children are starving in Karlsruhe, and I am eating this." Greta had no answer. Her own thoughts circled the same bitter truth. Her mother, if she were still alive, was likely queuing for hours for a ration of turnips or black bread. Her neighbors, the ones who had survived, were scavenging through ruins for anything edible. And here, in the hands of the enemy, she was being fed as if she mattered, as if her suffering were something to be alleviated rather than ignored. The meal ended, and the women were led back to their barracks. Night was falling, the camp lights flickering to life, casting long shadows across the yard. Greta climbed onto her bunk, the pillow waiting like a question she could not answer. She lay down slowly, her head sinking into the softness, and felt something break inside her. Not a collapse, but a crack, a fissure through which doubt began to seep. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the barracks settling into uneasy sleep. Some women wept quietly. Others whispered prayers. Margaret lay rigid on her bunk, refusing to use her pillow, her head resting instead on her folded coat. But Greta could not bring herself to reject the small mercy she had been given. She was too tired, too hollowed out by loss and fear, to sustain the armor of defiance. The pillow cradled her head, and for the first time in months, her neck did not ache. Her body relaxed despite her mind's protests, sinking into a comfort so profound it felt almost obscene. She thought of Anneliese, who had died without even the dignity of a proper burial. She thought of her father, whose grave, if he had one, she would never find. She thought of her mother's last letter, the ink smudged with what might have been tears. And she thought of the Americans, these strange, incomprehensible captors who fed their prisoners and gave them pillows as if such things were not privileges but rights. It made no sense. It violated everything she had been taught about the enemy, everything she had believed about the war. And yet here it was, undeniable, a softness that unsettled her more than any cruelty could have. Sleep came slowly, fitfully, haunted by dreams of burning cities and empty dinner tables. But when she woke in the gray light of dawn, her head still resting on the pillow, Greta realized with a cold clarity that something had shifted. The war she had fought in her mind, the war of absolutes and certainties, had begun to crumble. And the most terrifying part was not what the Americans might do to her, but what they had already done. They had fed her. They had given her a place to wash. They had offered her a pillow. And in doing so, they had planted a seed of doubt that no amount of propaganda could uproot. The physical comforts were devastating precisely because they were so mundane, so human, so impossible to reconcile with the image of a barbaric enemy. As the bell rang for morning roll call, Greta sat up, her body stiff but rested in a way it had not been for months. She looked at the pillow, its surface wrinkled from where her head had lain, and felt a surge of anger so fierce it nearly choked her. How dare they? How dare they make her feel anything other than hatred? How dare they offer kindness when her world had been reduced to ash? But beneath the anger was something else, something she could not yet name. A question. A crack in the foundation. A whisper that perhaps, just perhaps, the enemy was not what she had been told. And if that were true, if the Americans were capable of this small, bewildering mercy, then what else might she have been wrong about? The days that followed were a study in cognitive dissonance. Each morning, the women were roused by the bell and marched to the mess hall for breakfast. Each meal was the same quiet revelation: eggs, sometimes scrambled, sometimes fried. Bread with jam. Porridge sweetened with sugar. Coffee that tasted like memory, like mornings before the war when her father had still been alive and her sister had laughed over breakfast. Greta ate mechanically, her mind in constant rebellion against her body's gratitude. She watched the guards, searching for signs of the cruelty she had been promised. But they were young, bored even, more interested in their cigarettes and idle conversation than in tormenting their prisoners. One guard, a lanky boy who looked no older than 20, even smiled at her once when she stumbled over a loose board. The smile was brief, reflexive, devoid of malice. It haunted her for hours. The camp operated with a precision that was almost German in its efficiency. Roll call at dawn. Breakfast. Work assignments for those deemed fit, light duties like folding laundry or sweeping the barracks. Lunch. Afternoon rest. Dinner. Lights out. The rhythm was monotonous but stable, and stability, Greta was discovering, was its own form of torment. It left too much room for thought, for the mind to wander into dangerous territory. At night, lying on her bunk with her head sinking into the pillow she could no longer bring herself to reject, Greta found herself thinking not of what the Americans had done to her, but of what they had not done. They had not beaten her. They had not starved her. They had not violated her. Instead, they had done something far more insidious. They had treated her like a human being. Margaret continued to refuse her pillow, sleeping instead with her head on a folded blanket, her face a mask of grim determination. "They want us weak," she hissed one night, her voice low and venomous. "They want us grateful. Don't give them the satisfaction." But Greta could no longer sustain that level of resistance. Her body, after so many months of deprivation, had seized upon the small comforts with a hunger that overrode her pride. And with each passing day, the pillow became less a symbol of the enemy's manipulation and more a simple, undeniable fact. It was soft. It eased her pain. It helped her sleep. These were truths her body understood even as her mind recoiled. One afternoon, as Greta sat outside the barracks mending a torn seam in her uniform, a group of American nurses passed by, their white uniforms bright against the drab gray of the camp. They were laughing, their voices light and carefree, as if the war were a distant inconvenience rather than a cataclysm. Greta watched them with a mixture of envy and resentment. How easy it must be, she thought bitterly, to laugh when your cities were intact, when your families were alive, when victory had cost you so little. But then one of the nurses noticed her staring and waved, a small, friendly gesture. Greta did not wave back, but she did not look away either. She saw in that moment not an enemy, but a girl, perhaps her own age, whose life had unfolded in a world so different from her own that they might as well have been from separate planets. And yet here they were, sharing the same space, breathing the same air, connected by the thin thread of a war that had shattered one world and left the other largely untouched. That night, as she lay on her bunk, Greta thought of the pillow not as a gift, but as a question. What did it mean that the enemy could afford to offer such things? What did it say about the world she had believed in, the world she had fought for, that her own leaders could not, or would not, provide even these basic comforts? The questions gnawed at her, relentless and unanswerable. Helene, the nurse, spoke one evening in a hushed voice. "I keep thinking about the pillow," she said, her eyes red-rimmed. "It's such a small thing. But I can't stop thinking about it. Why would they give us this? What do they want from us?" Greta had no answer. But she knew, deep in the marrow of her bones, that the pillow had become more than fabric and stuffing. It was a wedge, a crack in the certainty that had sustained her through the war. And as the days turned into weeks, that crack widened, letting in light that both illuminated and blinded. The Americans did not interrogate them, at least not in the way Greta had expected. There were no torture chambers, no midnight grillings, no threats of execution. Instead, there were forms to fill out, questions asked with clinical detachment. Name. Rank. Unit. Place of birth. The answers were recorded on clipboards and filed away, and the women were returned to their barracks without ceremony. It was all so ordinary. And that ordinariness was perhaps the most disorienting aspect of captivity. Greta had been prepared for extremes, for violence or deprivation that would confirm her worst fears. Instead, she found herself in a strange limbo, a place where the enemy fed her, sheltered her, and left her alone with her thoughts. And those thoughts, freed from the immediate demands of survival, began to turn inward, questioning everything she had once taken for granted. One night, as she lay in the darkness, her head cradled by the pillow she had come to depend on, Greta whispered a single word into the silence. "Why?" No one answered. But the question lingered, echoing through the barracks, mingling with the soft sounds of breathing and the occasional muffled sob. Why had the Americans chosen kindness over cruelty? Why had they offered pillows and meals when hatred would have been easier, more justified even? And what did it mean for her, for all of them, that the enemy had proven capable of mercy? As dawn broke once more, the bell rang, calling them to another day of meals and routines and small, unbearable comforts. Greta rose, smoothing the blanket over her pillow, and felt the weight of the question settle deeper into her chest. The war outside the barbed wire might have ended, but the war inside her mind was only just beginning. And she knew, with a certainty that filled her with dread, that the softness of the pillow had already changed her in ways she could not yet fully understand. The Americans, she realized, had not broken her with cruelty. They were breaking her with kindness. And the most terrifying part was that she could feel herself beginning to yield. The pillow had been only the beginning. What followed in the weeks after their arrival at Camp Eldridge was a systematic dismantling of everything Greta Hoffman had been taught to believe. The Americans, it seemed, were not content with merely feeding their prisoners or offering them physical comfort. They wanted something far more ambitious, far more dangerous. They wanted to change how the women thought. It began subtly, almost innocently. One morning, after the usual roll call and breakfast, the women were informed that educational sessions would be held 3 times per week in a converted storage building at the edge of the camp. Attendance was mandatory. The announcement was met with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Greta exchanged glances with Helene, whose eyes reflected the same wary confusion she felt. What could the Americans possibly want to teach them? The classroom, when they entered it for the first time, was sparse but functional. Wooden benches arranged in rows. A chalkboard mounted on the wall. Boxes of books stacked in the corner, their spines showing titles in both German and English. A single American officer, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes, stood at the front of the room. She introduced herself as Captain Eleanor Mitchell, formerly a schoolteacher from Massachusetts, now tasked with what she called re-education. The word hung in the air like a threat. Re-education. Greta felt her spine stiffen. This was it, then. The indoctrination they had all feared. The Americans would try to twist their minds, to make them denounce their homeland, to turn them into traitors. Margaret, sitting 2 rows ahead, crossed her arms over her chest, her jaw set in defiance. But Captain Mitchell did not begin with propaganda or political speeches. Instead, she wrote a single word on the chalkboard in precise, blocky letters: democracy. "Can anyone tell me what this word means?" she asked in fluent German, her accent only slightly foreign. Silence. The women stared at the word as if it were a trap. Finally, a younger woman named Britta, barely 21, raised her hand tentatively. "It means, the people vote?" Captain Mitchell nodded. "Yes. The people vote. They choose their leaders. They have a voice in how they are governed. Does anyone here come from a country where this happens?" More silence. Greta felt heat rising in her face. Of course they had voted. There had been elections. The Führer had been chosen. But even as she thought this, something nagged at her memory, something about ballot boxes already marked, about choices that were not really choices at all. Captain Mitchell seemed to read the room's discomfort. She did not press. Instead, she began to talk, her voice calm and measured, about the history of democracy, about ancient Athens and the American Revolution, about ideas that had shaped nations and toppled kings. She spoke of freedom of speech, of the press, of assembly. She spoke of rights that belonged to individuals rather than states. Greta listened despite herself, her mind simultaneously resisting and absorbing. These were enemy ideas, dangerous ideas, the kind of liberalism that had been blamed for Germany's weakness after the First War. And yet, as Captain Mitchell spoke, weaving stories of ordinary people standing up to tyranny, of farmers and shopkeepers demanding representation, Greta found herself leaning forward, drawn into the narrative despite her intentions. The first session ended with Captain Mitchell handing out thin pamphlets printed in German. "Read these before our next meeting," she instructed. "We will discuss them." Greta took her pamphlet back to the barracks and hid it beneath her mattress, as if it were contraband. That night, unable to sleep despite the comfort of her pillow, she pulled it out and read by the faint light filtering through the window. The pamphlet was titled The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it outlined principles that seemed, at first glance, absurdly idealistic. The right to life, liberty, and security of person. The right to education. The right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. She read it twice, then a third time, her hands trembling. If these were truly universal rights, then what had happened to them in Germany? When had her government honored her right to think freely, to speak without fear? She thought of the neighbors who had disappeared in the night, the whispered rumors of camps far worse than this one, the propaganda that had drowned out all dissenting voices. And she felt something crack inside her, a hairline fracture in the foundation of her beliefs. The next session introduced films. The women were herded into the mess hall where a projector had been set up, its mechanical were filling the space as the lights dimmed. Greta braced herself, expecting more propaganda, perhaps images of American military might meant to humiliate them. Instead, the screen flickered to life with footage that made her stomach turn. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms, barely alive, stumbling toward camera crews. Mountains of bodies, emaciated and twisted, bulldozed into mass graves. Gas chambers disguised as showers. Ovens built for burning human beings. The camps had names: Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. And the footage was not American propaganda. It was German reality, filmed by Allied forces as they liberated these places of horror. The room was utterly silent except for the projector's rattle and the occasional gasp or sob. Greta sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the bench so hard her knuckles went white. She had heard rumors, yes, whispers of labor camps in the East, of harsh treatment for enemies of the state. But this? This systematic extermination, this industrial-scale murder? Her mind rejected it even as her eyes could not look away. When the lights came back on, many women were weeping openly. Others sat in stunned silence, faces drained of color. Margaret stood abruptly and walked out, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Captain Mitchell did not call her back. Instead, she stood at the front of the room and spoke in a voice that was gentle but unyielding. "These camps were run by your government," she said. "By men who claimed to be making Germany strong, who promised order and prosperity. This is what that order looked like. This is what that strength built." Greta wanted to scream that she hadn't known, that none of them had known, that they were just women doing their jobs, following orders, trying to survive. But the words died in her throat because she realized, with sickening clarity, that ignorance was not innocence. She had seen Jewish families disappear from her neighborhood. She had watched books burn in public squares. She had heard the speeches about racial purity in Lebensraum. And she had chosen to believe it was for the greater good, that the leadership knew best, that sacrifice was necessary for the nation's survival. The pillow that night offered no comfort. Greta lay awake, the images from the film replaying behind her closed eyelids. She thought of her sister, Anneliese, who had died in a bombing raid. She thought of her father, lost on the Eastern Front. And she wondered, for the first time, whether their deaths had been in service of something righteous or something monstrous. The question was unbearable, but she could no longer push it away. The education sessions continued relentlessly. They read excerpts from banned books, from authors who had been declared enemies of the state. They studied newspaper articles from Allied countries, accounts of the war from perspectives they had never been allowed to hear. They learned English vocabulary, halting and clumsy at first, but gradually gaining fluency. The language felt strange in their mouths, lighter somehow than German, less weighted with authority. Captain Mitchell introduced them to American literature. Greta found herself reading Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, struggling through the colloquial English but captivated by the story of a boy rejecting the society that told him to turn in a runaway slave. The parallels were uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. Huck's crisis of conscience, choosing humanity over law, friendship over duty, mirrored the questions now tearing through her own mind. There were moments of unexpected levity. During one English lesson, Captain Mitchell tried to teach them American idioms. "It's raining cats and dogs," she said, and the literal translation sent the women into surprised laughter. The absurdity of the phrase, the image of animals falling from the sky, broke through their tension. For a few minutes, they were simply students struggling with a difficult language, and the weight of war and guilt lifted just slightly. But the laughter always felt dangerous, almost treasonous. Greta caught herself smiling during a lesson about American jazz music, the syncopated rhythms and improvisations so different from the rigid marches she had grown up with. Then she would remember her mother's last letter, the desperation in those shaky words, and the smile would die on her lips. How could she enjoy anything while her people suffered? The camp library became both sanctuary and battleground. Shelves lined with books in multiple languages, more volumes than Greta had seen since before the war when public libraries had been purged of degenerate literature. She would slip away during free hours, running her fingers along the spines, pulling down volumes at random. Philosophy, history, poetry, novels from authors whose names she had been taught to despise. One afternoon, she discovered a collection of speeches by Winston Churchill. She read them in secret, tucked into a corner of the library where no one could see. His words painted Germany not as a noble nation betrayed by enemies, but as an aggressor drunk on conquest, a threat to civilization itself. The characterization stung, but she could not dismiss it as easily as she once would have. Not after the films. Not after the evidence of what her government had done. Helene found her there once, caught her quickly hiding the Churchill volume. Instead of judging, Helene sat down beside her and whispered, "I've been reading about the Weimar Republic. Before Hitler. They had elections, Greta. Real ones. Multiple parties. Free press. What happened to all of that?" Greta had no answer. But the question itself was revolutionary. They were beginning to think critically, to question not just American claims but their own history, their own complicity. It was exhausting and exhilarating and terrifying all at once. The Americans also provided newspapers, carefully curated but still revealing. Articles about the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders were being prosecuted for war crimes. Photographs of Göring and Hess and others in the dock, stripped of their uniforms and authority, facing judgment. Greta read these accounts with a mixture of vindication and dread. Part of her wanted to see these men punished for what they had done. Another part recognized that their guilt implicated her too, in ways she was only beginning to understand. Statistics began to filter through the camp, shared in hushed conversations or printed in the educational materials. Over 370,000 German prisoners held by the United States alone. Millions more scattered across Allied territories. And in those American camps, libraries, schools, even vocational training programs. The contrast with how Germany had treated its captives, slave labor, starvation, extermination, was impossible to ignore. One evening, during a group discussion session, a woman named Liesel broke down sobbing. "My husband was a guard at Sachsenhausen," she confessed. "He wrote to me once about the work they did there. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself he was exaggerating, that it couldn't be as bad as he described. But it was, wasn't it? It was worse." The room fell silent. No one condemned her, but no one offered comfort either. They were all complicit in their own ways, all guilty of choosing ignorance, of accepting convenient lies. The Americans did not force confessions or demand public repentance. They simply presented evidence and let it work on their consciences. Greta began writing in a notebook she had been given, filling pages with thoughts she could not speak aloud. She wrote about her brother, imagining conversations they would never have, asking him if he had known, if he had suspected. She wrote about her mother, wondering whether the woman who had raised her with such care could have supported a regime that built death camps. She wrote about herself, about the pride she had felt wearing her uniform, about the certainty that had sustained her through hardship. And she wrote about the pillow. "The pillow was the first weapon," she scrawled one night. "Not because it hurt, but because it made us feel. They fed our bodies first, then our minds. And now I cannot tell where the prisoner ends and the student begins. I hate them for this. I hate myself more for responding to it. The guilt was crushing. Every meal felt like betrayal. Every lesson absorbed was another step away from loyalty to her homeland, her family, her dead. But the alternative, to close her mind, to reject knowledge, to cling to disproven beliefs, felt like a different kind of death. She was trapped between two impossibilities, and the tension was tearing her apart. Captain Mitchell seemed to understand this struggle. She never pushed too hard, never demanded declarations of loyalty or forced announcements. Instead, she would end sessions with open-ended questions. "What do you think?" she would ask. "How does this information challenge what you previously believed? What questions do you still have?" The invitation to think, to question, to doubt, this was perhaps the most subversive gift of all. In the Germany Greta had known, questioning was weakness, doubt was treason. Here, it was encouraged, even celebrated. The shift was dizzying. Months passed. Summer gave way to autumn, the camp trees turning gold and red. The women had settled into routines, their bodies healthy, their minds in turmoil. Some, like Margaret, remained hardened, refusing to engage with the educational programs beyond the bare minimum required. Others, like Helene, embraced the learning with almost desperate hunger, as if knowledge could somehow atone for past ignorance. Greta existed somewhere between these extremes, pulled in both directions. She attended every session, read every book, wrote in her notebook until her hand cramped. But she also lay awake at night, her head on that damnable pillow, feeling the weight of her transformation and resenting it with every fiber of her being. One afternoon, Captain Mitchell announced a special session. They would be watching footage of liberated concentration camp survivors returning to their homes, rebuilding their lives. The film showed skeletal men and women, children with hollow eyes, slowly regaining strength, finding family members, grieving those lost. It showed synagogues reopening, communities forming, resilience in the face of unimaginable horror. And it showed something else, American soldiers helping these survivors, providing food and medical care, treating them with dignity and compassion. The same soldiers who now guarded Greta and fed her and gave her pillows. The contrast was impossible to reconcile. These Americans had liberated concentration camps while providing comfort to the auxiliaries who had served the regime that built them. After the film, Greta raised her hand for the first time in weeks. Captain Mitchell nodded at her. "Yes? Why?" Greta's voice cracked. "Why do you treat us like this? We were part of that system. We wore the uniforms. Why give us pillows and books when those people," she gestured at the now blank screen, "suffered so much?" Captain Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Because we believe people can change. Because we believe education is more powerful than punishment. Because treating you humanely doesn't diminish their suffering, it honors it by refusing to perpetuate cycles of cruelty. And because you are not the same as the men who ran those camps, even if you were part of the same nation." The answer was both comforting and infuriating. It offered grace Greta wasn't sure she deserved. It suggested a worldview so fundamentally different from what she had known that it felt like standing on foreign soil, the ground shifting beneath her feet. As autumn deepened, whispers began circulating through the camp. Release. Repatriation. The war had been over for months, eventually they would be sent home. The thought filled Greta with dread rather than joy. Home to what? To ruins? To hunger? To a Germany that had been divided, occupied, defeated? And more troubling still, who was she now? Could she return as the same woman who had left, or had the Americans succeeded in their quiet mission of transformation? The pillow, worn now from months of use, still cradled her head each night. It had become as familiar as breathing, this small comfort that had once seemed so dangerous. She could no longer imagine sleeping without it, and that dependency terrified her. What other dependencies had formed? What other changes had taken root while she wasn't looking? One final session stood out. Captain Mitchell brought in a German-American translator, an older man who had fled Germany in the 1930s. He spoke to them about his experience, about watching from abroad as his homeland descended into madness, about the pain of exile and the relief of escape. He did not condemn them, but he did not excuse them either. "You will go home soon," he said. "And you will carry with you two Germanys. The one you believed in, and the one that actually existed. Learning to live with that contradiction is the hardest work you will ever do. But it is necessary work. For yourselves, and for whatever comes next." His words haunted Greta. Two Germanys. Two selves. The woman who had arrived at Camp Eldridge, terrified and certain in her beliefs. And the woman who would leave, fed and educated and irreparably changed. She did not know how to reconcile these versions, how to carry both forward. The announcement came in late November. The women of Camp Eldridge would begin repatriation in waves, starting in December. They would be processed, given travel documents, and sent back to occupied Germany. The news was met with mixed reactions. Some women wept with relief. Others sat in stunned silence. Margaret actually smiled for the first time in months, vindicated in her belief that captivity would end. Greta felt only emptiness. The final weeks were a blur of preparations. Medical examinations. Paperwork. Lists of names and destinations. Captain Mitchell held a last educational session, more subdued than usual. She did not give speeches about democracy or human rights. She simply said, "Whatever you do with what you've learned here is up to you. But you cannot unlearn it. That is both the burden and the gift." On the day of departure, Greta packed her small bundle. The tattered coat. The broken comb. The notebook filled with her anguished thoughts. And then she looked at the pillow on her bunk, the white fabric yellowed now from months of use, the impression of her head still visible in its surface. She reached for it, then stopped. It would be absurd to take it, impractical, a theft of American property. But more than that, taking it would be an admission. That she had changed. That she had been broken. That the enemy had won some invisible war for her soul. Instead, she smoothed the pillowcase one last time, her hand lingering on the softness that had undone her more effectively than any interrogation. Then she turned away, picked up her bundle, and walked toward the barracks door where other women were gathering. Helene caught up with her, carrying her own meager possessions. "Are you ready?" she asked. Greta almost laughed. "No." "Are you?" "No." They walked together toward the gates, the same gates they had entered months ago expecting brutality and finding only bewildering kindness. American guards processed them efficiently, handing out travel documents and ration cards. Captain Mitchell stood off to the side, watching her students depart. When she caught Greta's eye, she nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that held no triumph, only a quiet recognition of the work they had done together. The truck ride to the train station was silent. The women who had spent months together, who had argued and wept and learned side by side, now had nothing to say. They were each alone with the weight of transformation, carrying knowledge they had not asked for and could not return. The train rattled eastward through a Europe still scarred by war. Greta pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape slide past. Villages reduced to rubble. Burned forests. Bridges half collapsed. The destruction was immense, incomprehensible. And somewhere in this wasteland was home, or what remained of it. When they crossed into the Soviet occupation zone, the contrast with American-controlled territory was immediate. Soviet guards boarded the train, their expressions hard, their manner brusque. They checked papers with suspicion, questioned travel purposes, confiscated anything deemed contraband. Greta watched them work and thought of the American guards at Camp Eldridge, their casual efficiency, their general lack of cruelty. Two different occupiers. Two different worlds. The train finally stopped at what had once been Chemnitz, now renamed and administered by Soviet authorities. Greta disembarked onto a platform crowded with displaced persons, refugees, returnees all searching for fragments of their former lives. The chaos was overwhelming after the ordered calm of the camp. She found her way through the ruins to the neighborhood where her family's home had stood. It was worse than she had imagined. Not just damaged but obliterated. Entire blocks reduced to rubble, the streets barely recognizable. She stood where her home should have been, trying to orient herself by the position of streets, by the shell of a church in the distance. A neighbor she vaguely recognized, an old man leaning on a cane, approached her. "The Hoffmans?" he asked, recognizing her face. "Yes. Do you know? Your mother died 2 months ago. Pneumonia. There was no medicine." He said it matter-of-factly, without cruelty but without gentleness either. Death had become too common for ceremony. "Your father never returned from the East. Your sister, I heard, died in a firebombing back in '45. Greta nodded, the information landing like stones in her chest. She had already known most of this, had suspected the rest, but hearing it confirmed still felt like falling. "Thank you," she whispered. The old man studied her. "You look well fed," he said, and there was an edge to his voice. "Where have you been?" "American prisoner camp." His expression shifted, something between resentment and bitter amusement. "Of course. They took better care of you than we could take of ourselves." He limped away, leaving Greta standing alone amid the ruins. She found shelter with a distant cousin in the Soviet sector, a woman named Clara who lived in half a house, the other half collapsed from bombing. Clara was gaunt, her children thin and listless. They eyed Greta with undisguised suspicion, noting her relatively healthy appearance, the slight roundness in her cheeks that spoke of regular meals. "What did you do for the Americans?" Clara asked that first night, her voice sharp. "To eat so well?" "Nothing," Greta said. "They just fed us. There were educational programs, but..." "Educational programs?" Clara laughed bitterly. "Propaganda, you mean? They fattened you up and filled your head with their ideas. And now you come back here, where we've been starving, where my children haven't had meat in 6 months, and you tell me the Americans were kind?" Greta had no response. The guilt she had felt in the camp intensified now, faced with the reality of what her people had endured while she slept on pillows and attended lectures. She tried to make herself useful, helping with chores, sharing the small rations she had been given. But the resentment hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. At night, lying on a thin pallet on the floor, her head resting on bundled rags, Greta could not sleep. She thought constantly of the pillow at Camp Eldridge, the one she had left behind. Its absence was a physical ache, her neck and shoulders stiff, her head throbbing. But more than the physical discomfort, she missed what the pillow represented: order, routine, the strange security of captivity. Here, in the ruins of her homeland, there was only chaos. Food was scarce, distributed through Soviet ration cards that never seemed to stretch far enough. Coal for heating was hoarded jealously. Water had to be carried from communal pumps. Every day was a struggle for survival, and the survival felt hollow, purposeless. Greta tried to find work. The Soviet authorities were reconstructing, building their vision of a new Germany in the East. But jobs required party loyalty, public denunciations of fascism, embracing of communist ideology. She attended mandatory re-education sessions run by Soviet political officers, sessions that felt simultaneously familiar and alien. Like the American programs, but harsher, more demanding, insistent on not just learning but conversion. She found herself comparing everything to Camp Eldridge. The Soviet sessions lacked Captain Mitchell's patient questioning, they demanded agreement, not thought. The rations were meager compared to the meals she had eaten as a prisoner. The living conditions were far worse. And nowhere, in all of occupied Germany, was there a pillow. The realization crept over her slowly, horribly: she had been freer as an American prisoner than she was now as a Soviet-occupied citizen. The Americans had treated her better as an enemy than her own supposed liberators did as a comrade. The contradiction was unbearable. She began to withdraw into herself, speaking little, moving through days mechanically. Clara's children watched her with wary eyes, perhaps sensing something broken in her. Other returnees, women who had come back from Western zones, shared similar struggles. They were marked by their time in Allied hands, viewed with suspicion, accused of having been pampered or brainwashed. Some defended themselves angrily. Others, like Greta, simply fell silent. One frozen January evening, unable to sleep, Greta pulled out her notebook. By candlelight, she wrote, "I have returned to the Germany I fought for, and I do not recognize it. Or perhaps I recognize it too well. This is what we built, this rubble and hunger and suspicion. The Americans did not defeat us with bombs alone. They defeated us with pillows. They showed us what we could have been if we had chosen differently. And now I am home, and home is ashes, and I cannot unknow what I learned in captivity. The pillow haunts me. Its absence is a presence. I dream of softness and wake to stone." She stopped writing, her hand trembling from cold and emotion. The words felt like treason, but they were also truth. The Americans had indeed used pillows as weapons, not of destruction, but of revelation. They had shown her a world where enemies could be treated humanely, where comfort was not reserved for the loyal, where education was offered even to the defeated. And that vision, once seen, could not be unseen. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. Spring came reluctantly to the ruins, small green shoots pushing through rubble. Greta found work eventually, helping clear debris from bomb sites, backbreaking labor for meager pay. She worked alongside other women, all thin, all exhausted, all haunted by different ghosts. One day, during a break, she overheard two younger women talking about escape. "The Western zones," one whispered. "They say life is better there. The Americans have food. Medicine. They're rebuilding faster." Her companion shook her head nervously. "It's dangerous. The Soviets shoot people trying to cross. And anyway, why would the Americans help us now? The war is over." Greta wanted to speak, to tell them that the Americans had already helped, that she had seen their strange, unsettling kindness firsthand. But she stayed silent. Who would believe her? And even if they did, what good would it do? The world was divided now, split between competing visions of the future, and she was trapped on the wrong side of that divide. Yet the seed had been planted. The idea of escape, of return to the American zone, began to grow in her mind. Not because she believed she could reclaim the comfort of captivity, but because she could no longer live in this twilight existence, caught between two Germanys with no clear path forward. She thought of Captain Mitchell's words, "You will carry two Germanys with you." But carrying them in the Soviet zone felt impossible. Here, there was only one acceptable Germany, one permitted narrative, one way of thinking. The multiplicity the Americans had encouraged, the questioning, the doubt, the intellectual freedom, was forbidden here. Late one night, Greta made a decision. She would try to cross into the Western zones. Not to escape Germany, but to find the Germany that might still be possible, the one being rebuilt with Marshall Plan aid, with democratic institutions, with the lessons of defeat. It was a desperate gamble, potentially fatal. But staying felt like a different kind of death, a slow suffocation of the self she had become. She spent weeks preparing, saving scraps of food, studying maps, learning the patterns of Soviet patrols. She told no one, not even Clara, knowing that any leak could mean imprisonment or worse. The night she chose was moonless, the darkness absolute. She slipped out of the ruined house carrying nothing but her notebook and the clothes on her back. The journey was harrowing. Miles of rubble, patrols to avoid, checkpoints to circumvent. She moved like a ghost through the ruins of her homeland, terrified and determined in equal measure. Once, she heard shots in the distance, screams that cut off abruptly. She kept moving, her heart hammering, every shadow a potential threat. Days later, exhausted and half-starved, she stumbled across the demarcation line into the American zone. She was immediately detained, questioned, processed. When she explained she had been a POW at Camp Eldridge, when she showed her release papers, the American soldiers treated her with the same efficient courtesy she remembered. They gave her food, water, a place to sleep. And there, in a transit camp for displaced persons, on a military cot with standard-issue bedding, Greta laid her head on a pillow for the first time since leaving captivity. The softness was shocking, almost painful. She wept into it, months of suppressed grief and guilt and relief pouring out in silent sobs. The Americans had broken her with kindness, yes. But they had also, inadvertently, given her a standard by which to measure humanity. They had shown her that even enemies deserved dignity, that education could be liberation, that softness was not weakness. And in doing so, they had made it impossible for her to accept anything less. She did not know what would come next. The western zones were still struggling, still occupied, still bearing the scars of war. But here, at least, there was possibility. Here, the future was not yet written. Here, she might find a way to live with both Germanys she carried within her, the one that had been, and the one that might yet be. As she drifted towards sleep, her head cradled by the pillow she had risked her life to return to, Greta understood the final, terrible truth: the war had ended, but the real battle was indeed only just beginning. Not a battle of armies or ideologies, but a battle for meaning, for understanding, for the possibility of redemption. The pillow, that simple object of comfort, had become her symbol of that possibility. It represented not forgiveness, she did not deserve that, and knew it, but something more complex. It represented the idea that even in the aftermath of catastrophe, even bearing the weight of complicity and guilt, a person might still find moments of grace. Might still learn. Might still change. The softness that had shattered her certainty had, in the end, also saved her. And as dawn broke over the ruins of Europe, bringing with it another uncertain day, Greta Hoffman closed her eyes and let herself, for the first time since the war began, hope. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.